Good morning. It's Monday, November 29th, and tomorrow is a big day in the history of this country. Because tomorrow, the federal court, will take up the argument on whether or not to release the National Archive papers, the Trump papers from the National Archive, that supposedly will indicate what Trump and his colleagues were doing on January 6th, and whether or not they actually contributed to the violence that took place on that day. On a day that might be known as Stop the Steal Day. And President Trump has fought very hard to keep those papers away, claiming executive privilege, which is something that doesn't exist for him since he is no longer the president. So this will be a very interesting day tomorrow. We'll see what happens when the court reviews the issue of releasing those National Archive papers. The stoppage of these papers, of the release of these papers, was a short-term deal. And it was made by a 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, the circuit. That's what they call themselves, the circuit. This circuit of the Court of Appeals issued this stoppage of the release because I guess they wanted more information about why and whether this would be legal or not. So they issued this in order to give the lawyers for Congress and the lawyers for the former President Trump time to produce briefs to address the issue. And I assume that when they're producing this brief, it's going to say whether or not these participants agree or disagree with the release of these papers. What laws cover the release of these papers? Donald Trump has tried to claim executive privilege, but that doesn't really exist because he's no longer president. And so I think the major issue that these 3 judges are going to go over are the somewhat off-the-wall issues that Donald Trump has raised, claiming his executive privileges and his executive privilege powers. So tomorrow, November 30th, the Court of Appeals will hear the lawyers, read the briefs, and then they will be able to make, hopefully, a reasonable decision, because this has never happened before. This is a one-time deal. This is the first time anything like this has ever happened. And should Donald Trump win, this would be a monumental victory for him, but it also would set the country back, I don't know how many years. Because then at any time, anybody will try to get information from the National Archives. The opponents of releasing that information will have a leg to stand on and say, if President Trump was able to stop the release of these papers, why can't I stop the release of these papers? It's a very, very interesting situation that we find ourselves in. One that could change the shape of this country for a long, long time. So President Trump, former President Trump, tried to invoke executive privilege over the first set of archive materials from his White House archive material. But President Biden declined to echo that assertion, instead instructing the National Archives to turn over those materials on Friday if there was no order to do otherwise. But that's not what happened, because the Court of Appeals came up with this delay, which I guess is about 2 weeks old now. And so they're waiting for the briefs to come into the court and for the lawyers to argue the case. Now, as I said before, this is a very tricky deal. So tomorrow maybe the papers will be released, or maybe they won't. In the meantime, everybody that has been subpoenaed by the Congressional Committee, the January 6th Commission, has refused to show up. And this is driving me nuts. You have people who are subpoenaed, and they refuse to show up. And no action is taken against these people, or we can't take action against these people. So how in the world can we get to the bottom of anything if we have a situation where we can't get people to testify? So how do you run a democracy like that? How are you able to get anything done if people can defy the law without any consequences? So you have Mark Meadows, you have Steve Bannon, you have a whole bunch of other people who have been subpoenaed, and none of them have shown up. Nothing has happened. And it's a delaying tactic. There's no question about it. It's a delaying tactic. Because I'm sure these people are trying to delay until the 2022 election. In which case, if the Democrats lose their majorities, then these people just walk, because the Republicans won't follow up on this situation. They have no reason to follow up on this situation. In their minds, whatever happened on January 6th was good for this country. In their minds, this was nothing more than a regular tourist day on January 6th. So this whole thing is a disaster. It's a disaster because we can't get anything done. There ought to be some set of rules and regulations that say, if such and such happens, we have to resolve it in such and such an amount of time. At every twist and turn, we find that nothing's happening. And you know who the master of that game is? The master of that game is President Trump, ex-President Trump. He's a master of delaying tactics. He's been doing this for years in private industry and business and everything. So he knows the court system better than anybody else, probably. He could probably be an instructor in cheating democracy at some high-level university or something. This is crazy. This thing will drag on and on and on, and it's not doing the country any good. We have to get to the bottom of this. Settle this whole thing already. Let's get some work done. This is a disaster. In any event, you can see how unhappy I am about this whole thing. I see no reason why you can't put pressure on people to testify. They could stand up there and take the fifth, that's okay. But at least they should show up for their court appearance and not defy the court by not showing up. And then nothing happens to them. Maybe if every day they didn't show up, it cost them $1,000 or $2,000 or $5,000 or some ridiculous amount of money. Something ought to be done about this part of the system. In any event, that's all I have today, and I'll see you in the morning. Bye.